The floor tiles in the briefing room were cracked. A jagged line ran through the third one from the left. I memorized that crack because it was the only safe place to look. Captain Isla Reyes stood at the front of the room, her voice cutting through the early morning haze like a siren, asking for the inventory count on the rig. I felt the heat rise up the back of the neck. I knew if I looked up, if I met those dark, unflinching eyes, I wouldn't just report the missing saline bags. I'd say the thing that had been clawing at my throat for 3 months. I'd say, I love you. And that would end my career. I didn't come to Station 42 looking for complications. I came because the city burned me out. 3 years of high-volume calls in the metro area left me feeling hollowed out, like a building after a 3-alarm blaze where only the frame is left standing. I needed the quiet. I needed the coast. I drove my truck up the winding highway, watching the fog cling to the pines, telling myself this was just a job, just another station house, just another crew. I was wrong. Station 42 sat on a bluff, overlooking the gray, churning Pacific. When I walked into the apparatus bay that first Tuesday, the air was heavy. It smelled of diesel exhaust, wet turnout gear, and old coffee, the universal scent of fire service. But underneath it was the sharp, brine-soaked tang of the ocean. The bay doors were open, and the sound of the waves provided a constant, rhythmic thrum beneath the static of the dispatch radio. Then I saw her. Captain Reyes was by the engine, inspecting a Halligan bar. She didn't look like the captains I was used to, bureaucrats pushing paper behind a desk. She held the heavy steel tool like it was an extension of her arm. Balanced. Lethal. She was checking the ad's end for burrs, her focus absolute. She turned when my boots crunched on the concrete. "You must be Vance," she said. She wasn't shouting, but her voice carried over the hum of the industrial fridge. It was a low, gravelly sound. She looked at me the way a mechanic looks at an engine, checking for leaks, checking for weakness. "Yes, Captain, Eliza Vance, but everyone calls me Ellie." "We'll see," she said. She wiped her hand on a rag tucked into her belt and extended it. When I took her hand, I expected the usual firm, professional shake. What I got was a jolt that started in my fingertips and rattled my teeth. Her skin was rough, dry, warm. Calluses from rope work and axe handles. Her grip was absolute. For 3 seconds, she didn't let go, and I forgot how to breathe. I forgot my transfer papers in my other hand. I forgot the speech I'd rehearsed about being a team player. "Welcome to the house, Vance. Don't get comfortable yet. We run drills in 10. That was it. She turned her back and walked away, her ponytail swinging slightly with the rhythm of her stride. I stood there, my hands still tingling, wondering what the hell just happened. The first week was a blur of adrenaline and silence. I tried to keep my head down. I focused on the rig, organizing the med bag, checking the oxygen tanks, scrubbing the gurney until the aluminum shone under the fluorescent lights. But I was always watching her. I couldn't help it. I watched her during Tuesday drills. We were working on vehicle stabilization. The crew was joking around, blowing off steam, but Isla, Captain Reyes, was pure focus. She moved with a terrifying efficiency. She didn't just tell them where to place the cribbing. She showed them. She threw a 40-pound block of wood like it was styrofoam. She crawled under an unstable sedan without hesitation to check the struts. There was dirt on her cheek. Sweat made her uniform shirt cling to her shoulders. I caught myself staring at the line of her jaw as she shouted commands over the roar of the hydraulic spreaders. It wasn't just that she was attractive. It was the authority, the absolute certainty in her movements. In a job where hesitation gets people killed, she was a solid rock. I felt a pull in my chest, a physical ache that had nothing to do with the labor. It felt like gravity. One afternoon, I was restocking the trauma kit in the back of the ambulance. The bay was quiet. I thought I was alone until I felt a presence. "You're efficient," she said from the doorway. I jumped, dropping a roll of gauze. Isla was leaning against the frame, arms crossed. She was watching me. "I try to be, Captain. Most transfers take a month to figure out where we keep the extra saline. You found it in 2 days. I don't like wasting time." "Good." She pushed off the doorframe and walked toward me. The space inside the ambulance suddenly felt microscopic. She reached past me to grab a clipboard, her arm brushing against my shoulder. The contact was light, barely there, but my skin burned where she touched me. I smelled her then. Smoke, peppermint soap, and something darker, like rain on hot asphalt. "We have a tight crew here, Vance," she said, her voice low. "We trust each other with our lives. Don't give me a reason to doubt you." "I won't," I managed to whisper. She held my gaze for a long beat, her eyes dark and unreadable. Then she nodded and walked away, leaving me trembling in the back of the rig, clutching a roll of gauze like a lifeline. I knew then that I was in trouble. This wasn't just respect for a superior officer. This was the beginning of a fall, and I didn't have a parachute. The problem with a rural station isn't the work. It's the intimacy. In the city, you can disappear into the chaos of a shift change, hide behind the sheer volume of calls. But at Station 42, the silence was a magnifying glass. We lived in each other's pockets for 48 hours at a time. The walls were thin, the bunk room was shared, and there was nowhere to run from the feeling that was slowly taking over my nervous system. It started with the proximity. On a skeleton crew, titles blur when the work needs doing. One night, my partner Davis was in the back of the rig managing a complex cardiac patient who wouldn't stabilize. We needed hands. Isla jumped into the driver's seat of the ambulance without a word, taking the wheel for the hour-long transport to the county hospital. I sat in the passenger seat on the return trip, the empty gurney rattling behind us. It was 2 a.m. The coastal highway was a ribbon of wet asphalt, illuminated only by our headlights and the occasional sweep of the lighthouse beam cutting through the fog. The cab was dark, lit only by the green glow of the dashboard. I tried to look out the window, to count the mile markers, but my eyes kept drifting to her hands. She drove with a casual, terrifying competence. Her left hand rested at the 12 o'clock position, her fingers loose but ready. The dash lights caught the silver of her watch, the strong tendons in her wrist. Every time she shifted gears, her arm brushed against the fabric of my jacket. The air in the cab felt pressurized, thick enough to choke on. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but I was paralyzed by the fear that my voice would betray me. If I spoke, it wouldn't be about the call. It would be about the way the shadows fell across her face. So I stayed silent, clutching the door handle, while my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The torture didn't end when the engine turned off. The kitchen was worse. The galley table is the altar of the fire service, the place where trust is built over lukewarm chili and bad coffee. Davis and the others were loud, cracking jokes, debriefing the calls, complaining about the administration. I sat at the end of the table, pushing food around my plate, feeling like a spy in enemy territory. Isla would sit at the head, usually reading a report or listening to the banter with a faint, guarded smile. Sometimes she'd look up. She had a way of scanning the table, checking the morale of her crew. Every time her gaze swept over me, I flinched internally. I studied the grain of the wood table. I studied the steam rising from my coffee. I studied the cracks in the linoleum floor. I became an expert on everything in that room, except the face of the woman I was falling for. "Vance, you're quiet tonight," she said once, her voice cutting through the laughter of the other firefighters. My head snapped up. She was looking right at me, her expression curious, open. For a split second, I let myself look back. The kitchen light was harsh, but it made her eyes look like polished amber. There was a question there, something deeper than a captain checking on a subordinate. "Just tired, Captain," I lied. "Long transport." She held my gaze for a second too long before nodding. "Get some rest then. We need you sharp." I fled. I started volunteering for every task that kept me away from the communal spaces. I became the queen of inventory. While the rest of the crew watched movies in the day room, I was out in the freezing apparatus bay, counting box after box of nitrile gloves. I reorganized the supply closet 3 times in 2 weeks. I scrubbed the wheel wells of the engine until my knuckles were raw. It was a pathetic strategy. I told myself I was being professional, maintaining boundaries. But the truth was simpler and far more pathetic. I was hiding. I was hiding because every time I was in a room with her, the urge to cross the line, to touch her arm, to ask her about her life, To tell her she was the reason I woke up looking forward to work became harder to suppress. I was isolating myself from the team to protect a secret that felt like it was burning a hole in my chest. I thought the distance would help. I thought if I stayed cold, the fire would go out. I didn't know that oxygen just feeds the flame. And I didn't know that the distance I was so carefully building was about to collapse under the weight of a single, catastrophic tone. The tones dropped at 3:14 a.m. It wasn't the medical chime that usually woke us up. It was the long, wavering warble of a structure fire. The sound tore me out of a dreamless sleep and into my boots before my eyes were fully open. By the time I hit the apparatus bay floor, the adrenaline was already flooding my system, turning the cold concrete into a launch pad. Structure fire, persons reported. 1200 block of Old Mill Road. The dispatcher's voice crackled, calm against the rising panic in the room. Persons reported changes everything. It shifts the gear from property conservation to life safety in a heartbeat. Isla was already in the officer's seat of the engine, headset on, face illuminated by the red glow of the cab lights. She looked calm, terrifyingly calm. As I climbed into the back, I caught her eyes in the rearview mirror. She didn't blink. She just gave a single, sharp nod. Game time. The ride was a blur of siren wails and the heavy, lurching sway of the engine on winding rural roads. I spent the 10 minutes fighting with my SCBA straps, trying to slow my breathing. When we rounded the final bend, the sky ahead wasn't black anymore. It was an angry, pulsing orange. The farmhouse was fully involved on the second floor. Flames were licking out of the dormer windows, curling up toward the slate roof like desperate fingers. The heat hit us the moment the doors opened, a physical weight pressing against our turnout gear. "Vance, grab the irons. You're with me," Isla commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the roar of the fire like a knife. Usually, the captain stays out to run incident command, but with a skeleton crew and a victim inside, the rules bent. She was going in. And she was taking me. We masked up at the front door. The click of the regulator locking into place is usually a moment of isolation. Your world shrinks to the sound of your own breathing. But as we crawled into the smoke-filled hallway, my world didn't shrink. It expanded to include her. I was right on her heels, my hand gripping the back of her coat, feeling every shift of her weight. The visibility was zero. The smoke was a thick, oily gray that swallowed our flashlight beams. We were moving by touch, by instinct. The heat was banking down, forcing us lower. I could feel the radiant energy soaking through my layers, a dull, oppressive ache. "Sound off!" Isla's voice came through the comms in my mask, distorted but steady. "Vance here!" Right hand search. Stay tight. We found him in the back bedroom. An elderly man, unconscious, slumped between the bed and the dresser. The room was getting hotter by the second. The thermal layer above us was churning, ready to flash. "Grab his legs!" Isla yelled. I scrambled into position. We had to lift him over the debris. It was awkward, heavy, desperate work. As I hoisted his legs and she grabbed under his arms, we were forced together in the narrow space. My shoulder slammed into hers. Her helmet knocked against mine. For a solid 10 seconds, we were a single unit of force, fighting against gravity and physics. I could feel the strain in her body through the contact, the sheer power she was exerting to drag this stranger to safety. We hit the hallway and the heat spiked. The ceiling was going to go. "Move, move, move!" she screamed. We dragged him down the hall, stumbling over hose lines, our bodies colliding with every step. I was practically wrapped around her side to keep the victim steady. In that chaos, surrounded by smoke that tasted like burning plastic and death, the only thing that felt real was the solid, unyielding presence of her arm against mine. It wasn't romantic in the soft, gentle sense. It was primal. It was the intimacy of survival. We burst out the front door just as the living room window blew out behind us. We collapsed on the wet grass, dragging the man clear of the collapse zone. Paramedics from the second due unit swarmed in, taking the patient, leaving us gasping on the lawn. I ripped my mask off, sucking in the cold, clean air. My lungs burned. My hands were shaking so hard I couldn't unclip my waist belt. "Vance." I looked up. Isla was kneeling next to me. She had pulled her mask off, revealing a face smeared with soot and sweat. Her hair was escaping her helmet, plastered to her forehead. She looked wild. She looked magnificent. She reached out and grabbed my shoulder, her grip hard, grounding me. "You okay?" she asked, her eyes scanning my face, searching for damage. "I'm good," I wheezed. "I'm good, Cap." "You stayed with me," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a kind of fierce intensity that made my stomach drop. "It got hairy in there. You didn't flinch." "I was following you," I said, the truth slipping out before I could catch it. "I'd follow you anywhere." The air between us suddenly felt hotter than the fire behind us. Her hand was still on my shoulder, her thumb pressing into the heavy fabric of my turnout coat. For a moment, the chaos of the scene, the shouting, the sirens, the crackle of the flames, faded into a dull buzz. There was just her, just the dark, intense pull of her gaze, and the terrifying realization that I meant it. I would walk into fire for her. Not for the job, not for the oath. For her. She held my eyes for a second longer, her expression shifting from professional concern to something softer, something startled. Then she pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned. "Good work, Vance," she said, her voice rougher than usual. "Get some water. Rehab is mandatory." She stood up and walked back toward the command post, barking orders into her radio. I sat there in the wet grass, watching her silhouette against the burning house, shivering, not from the cold, but from the terrifying clarity of what had just happened. I wasn't just falling in love with my captain. I was trusting her with my life, and she was trusting me with hers. And that mutual reliance was building a bridge I had promised myself I wouldn't cross. The fire was contained by dawn, but the walls I had built around myself were reduced to ash. I knew, as I watched the sun struggle to rise over the smoky horizon, that avoiding her wasn't going to work anymore. You can't hide from someone who has heard you breathe when you thought you were going to die. After the fire, I didn't step closer. I ran. I retreated into the station's shadows. I volunteered for the tasks nobody wanted, scrubbing the diesel soot off the bay walls, reorganizing the lockers, inventorying the expiration dates on every single vial of epinephrine in the supply room. I even polished the chrome on the bumper until I could see my own terrified reflection. I built a fortress out of busy work. If I was moving, I didn't have to think. If I was scrubbing, I didn't have to feel the ghost of her shoulder pressing against mine. The crew noticed. You can't be invisible in a house that sleeps 6. Davis cornered me by the coffee pot 3 shifts later. He was leaning against the counter, a mug in his hand, watching me aggressively wipe down a surface that was already clean. "You good, Vance?" he asked. It wasn't a casual question. "I'm fine," I said, not looking up. "Just like things organized." "You've barely said 10 words in 2 days. The guys are starting to think you think you're better than us. Or that you're hiding something." I froze. In a town like this, silence is suspicious. Gossip moves faster than wildfire here. If the crew thought I was aloof, that was manageable. If they thought I was hiding a secret, specifically a secret about the way I looked at the captain, that was lethal. "Just tired, Davis, adjusting to the sea air." He didn't buy it, but he let it go. Isla didn't let anything go. She watched me. During morning briefings, I could feel her eyes tracking me like radar. I became an expert at looking everywhere but at her. I studied the motivational posters from 1995. I counted the scuffs on the linoleum. I memorized the spine of the binder on the table. I answered her questions with clipped military precision, addressing the air above her left shoulder. "Inventory is complete, Captain." "Rig checks are green, Captain." "Understood, Captain." I stripped all the humanity out of my voice until I sounded like a dispatch computer. I saw her jaw tighten every time I did it. She knew. She was a woman who noticed when a bolt was loose on a truck. Of course she noticed when her newest medic was actively fleeing the room every time she entered. She analyzed the data points, the averted gaze, the hasty exits, the sudden obsession with the hose tower. The nights were the hardest. The station settles into a heavy, mechanical silence after midnight. I would lie in my bunk, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the building breathe. I could hear the hum of the ventilation, the distant crash of the ocean, and the sound of her. Her office was down the hall. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear her door open. Her footsteps were distinctive, heavy boot falls, but a light stride. I'd lie there, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, imagining her walking past my door. The urge to get up, to step into the hallway, and just exist in the same space as her was a physical ache. It felt like a fracture in my chest, sharp and jagged. But I stayed in bed. I stayed because she was the first female captain in the history of this county. She was a monument. She had clawed her way to that white shirt through grit and competence, fighting a boys' club mentality every step of the way. She had to be perfect. She had to be iron. If I let this slip, if I let myself want her out loud, I wouldn't just be breaking policy. I would be ammunition. The town would say she lost control of her house. They would say she let emotions compromise the chain of command. I couldn't be the reason she fell. I loved her too much to be her weakness. So I tried to fix it the only way I knew how. I went to the scheduling board on a Tuesday evening, intending to request a rotation transfer. I had the marker in my hand, hovering over the grid, my hand shaking. I was going to erase myself from her shift. It was the only way to keep her safe. Vance. The voice came from behind me, low, controlled, dangerous. My office. Now. Her office was a glass-walled fishbowl in the corner of the apparatus bay. But with the blinds drawn, it felt like a bunker. I walked in, and the door clicked shut behind me. That sound, the latch engaging, felt final. It was the sound of a trap springing, or maybe a vault locking. The air inside was different than the bay. It was still, smelling of lemon polish, old paper, and the faint, lingering scent of her peppermint soap. Isla didn't sit behind her desk. That would have been a disciplinary hearing. Instead, she leaned against the edge of the heavy oak surface, her arms crossed over her chest, her ankles crossed. It was a casual posture that felt completely calculated. It stripped away the barrier of the desk, but removed none of the authority. She was close enough that I could see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the way her uniform shirt strained slightly across her shoulders. "Explain," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was a low, grounded rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and straight up into my boots. I swallowed, my throat clicking dryly. "Explain what, Captain?" "Don't insult my intelligence, Vance. You're a good medic. You see things before they happen. So don't stand there and pretend you don't know what I'm asking." She uncrossed her arms and let her hands rest on the edge of the desk, gripping the wood until her knuckles turned white. "You're ghosting this crew. You're ghosting me. I saw you hovering over the transfer sheet yesterday. You've been here 3 months. You fit the house. You're good at the job. So why are you trying to run?" I stared at a map of the county pinned to the wall behind her. I focused on the blue line of the coast, tracing the jagged edge where the land met the sea. I think a rotation might be good for rounding out my skill set. Different houses, different call volumes. Bullshit. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. You came here specifically for the low volume. You told me that in your interview. You wanted the technical rescue work. You wanted the coast. She pushed off the desk and took a step toward me. The space between us shrank to nothing. Is it me? Have I done something? Do you have a problem with my leadership? The question hit me like a physical blow. The idea that she thought she was the failing factor, that her competence was in question because I couldn't control my own heart, was unbearable. I looked at her then. I couldn't help it. I looked straight into those dark, searching eyes, and my resolve crumbled like wet drywall. "No," I said, the word rushing out, breathless and desperate. "No, Captain, it's not you. You're the best officer I've ever worked under. It's not that." "Then what is it?" She didn't back down. Her gaze was a physical weight, pinning me to the spot. "Because I can't run a crew with a question mark on the roster. I need to know if I can trust you. And right now, you can't even look me in the eye for more than 2 seconds. That makes me nervous, Vance. And I don't like being nervous." "I'm not a question mark," I whispered. I'm just
what?
distracted. The word slipped out before I could catch it. It was a dangerous admission in a job where distraction kills people. Isla went very still. The hum of the computer fan seemed to roar in the silence. She tilted her head, studying me with a renewed, terrifying intensity. She wasn't looking at her subordinate anymore. She was looking at the woman standing in front of her, stripping away the uniform, the rank, the defenses. Distracted by what? She asked softly. I opened my mouth to lie, to invent a family crisis or a financial problem. But the lie died on my tongue. I couldn't do it. Not to her. By the situation. By the proximity. It was vague, but it was enough. I saw the realization hit her. It wasn't a sudden shock. It was a slow dawning, like the sun touching the water. Her eyes widened slightly, then darkened. Her gaze dropped to my mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back up to my eyes. The air in the room suddenly felt pressurized, thick enough to choke on. The electricity that had been humming under the surface for months arced between us, undeniable and terrifying. She took a breath, and I watched her chest rise and fall. Proximity, she repeated. The word sounded different in her mouth, heavier. I respect the chain of command, Captain, I said, my voice trembling. I respect this house. That's why I was looking at the transfer sheet. I thought it would be safer. Safer, she echoed. She looked down at her boots, then back at me. The hard lines of her face softened, just a fraction. The captain mask slipped, revealing the woman underneath. Someone lonely. Someone who recognized the same hunger I was trying to starve. Running doesn't make it safe, Ellie. It just makes it unresolved. She used my name. The sound of it in that professional space was like a match struck in a dark room. I don't know what to do, I admitted. I don't have a protocol for this. Neither do I. She ran a hand through her hair, pulling it back from her face. It was a gesture of frustration, or maybe resignation. But we can't have this conversation here. Not under these lights. Not with those bars on your collar and these bugles on mine. She walked around the desk, moving past me to the door. As she passed, the heat radiating off her was palpable. She stopped with her hand on the knob, not looking back. Meet me at the diner on the highway, the one with the neon crab sign. 2,000 hours. Wear civilian clothes. Captain? That's an order, Vance. But when you get there, leave the rank at the door. She opened the door, and the sounds of the station rushed back in. The radio chatter, the clatter of tools, the world we were supposed to be living in. But as I walked out, I knew we had just stepped into a different world entirely. One without maps or protocols. One where the only thing that mattered was the way she said my name. The neon crab sign buzzed with a dying electrical hum, casting a flickering red light across the wet pavement. I sat in my truck for 5 minutes, watching the rain streak the windshield, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. This was the line. Inside that diner, the strict hierarchy of the fire service dissolved into something murkier, something dangerous. I wasn't Officer Vance walking into a briefing. I was Ellie, walking into a confession. I pushed open the glass door and the bell chimed, a cheerful, tinny sound that felt jarring against the tightness in my chest. The diner smelled of frying onions, old vinyl, and damp coats. It was late, the Tuesday night crowd thin. A trucker hunched over a slice of pie at the counter. 2 teenagers whispered in the corner. And there she was. Isla sat in a booth near the back, away from the windows. Seeing her without the uniform was like seeing a weapon disassembled. She was still dangerous, still powerful, but different. She wore a dark charcoal sweater that looked soft, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, and dark jeans. No badge, no radio, no heavy boots. Her hair was down, loose around her shoulders in dark waves I had never seen before. It softened the sharp angles of her face, making her look younger, less like a monument and more like a woman waiting for a storm to break. I slid into the booth opposite her. The vinyl squeaked. The table between us was sticky with humidity, holding a sugar dispenser and 2 heavy ceramic mugs of black coffee that were already steaming. "You came," she said. Her voice was quieter here, stripped of the command tone she used on the fireground. "You gave an order," I replied, trying for a joke, but it fell flat. "I told you," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "Rank stays at the door. You're here because you wanted to be. She was right. I was here because the alternative was going back to my empty apartment and staring at the wall. Isla wrapped her hands around her mug. I watched her fingers, long, capable, free of the soot and grease I was used to seeing on them. I don't do this, she said, staring into the black liquid. I don't blur lines. I worked too hard to draw them. I know, I said. That's why I was going to transfer. I didn't want to be the smudge on your record. She looked up then, and the intensity in her gaze pinned me to the back of the booth. It's not about the record, Ellie. It's about the distraction. You said you were distracted by the proximity. You think you're the only one? My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I assumed I was. You assumed wrong. She took a sip of coffee, her eyes never leaving mine. Every time you walk into the bay, I lose my train of thought. I have to force myself to focus on the inventory sheets just to keep from watching you check the rig. When we were in that fire, when I felt you right behind me, I wasn't just thinking about the victim. I was thinking that if the roof came down, I wanted to be the one shielding you. The admission hung in the air, raw and terrifying. This wasn't just attraction. This was the kind of bone-deep pull that destroys carefully constructed lives. So, what are we doing? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. If we can't transfer and we can't focus, what is this? Isla set her mug down. She reached across the table. It was a slow, deliberate movement, giving me every chance to pull away, to leave, to run back to the safety of the station. I didn't move. Her hand covered mine. Her skin was warm, dry, electric. It wasn't the rough, adrenaline-fueled grip of the handshake on my first day. This was gentle. Her thumb brushed over my knuckles, tracing the tendons, learning the shape of my hand without the barrier of nitrile gloves or turnout gear. The contact sent a shockwave through me that settled low in my stomach. I don't want you to transfer, she said, her voice rough. I want you to stay. But if you stay, and if we do this, we have to be smarter than everyone else. We have to be invisible. I can be invisible, I said, turning my hand over so our palms met, fingers interlacing on the sticky tabletop. I've been hiding for months. No more hiding, she murmured. Not for me. We sat there for an hour, the coffee going cold, mapping out the impossible terrain of us. We talked about everything except the job. I learned she grew up 3 towns over, that she drove the coast road when she couldn't sleep. I told her about the city, about the burnout, about how I came here looking for quiet and found a hurricane instead. We have a shift in 8 hours, she said eventually, pulling her hand back reluctantly. Back to captain and subordinate, I said, the reality settling in. On the floor, yes, she agreed. She slid out of the booth and stood up, pulling on a leather jacket. She looked down at me, and for the first time, I saw a genuine, unguarded smile touch her lips. It changed her entire face, making her look radiant. But right now, I'm just the woman who wants to walk you to your truck. We walked out into the mist, the air smelling of salt and wet asphalt. At my truck, she stopped. She didn't kiss me. It was too exposed, too soon. But she leaned in close, her breath hitching, her eyes searching mine in the dark. I'm glad you didn't transfer, she whispered. Me too. She turned and walked to her car, and as I watched her go, I knew the safety of the cracked floor tiles was gone. I wasn't looking down anymore. The storm hit 3 days later. It wasn't just rain. It was an atmospheric river event that turned the sky into a bruise of purple and black. The station rattled. The wind howled around the bay doors like a wounded animal. We were all on edge, waiting for the inevitable. It came at 0200. Water rescue, Point Reyes headlands, kayaker in distress. The ride out was a nightmare. The rig hydroplaned on the slick asphalt. Isla drove with white-knuckled precision, her eyes narrowing against the onslaught of rain that the wipers couldn't clear fast enough. I sat in the passenger seat, watching her profile. She was calm, the eye of the hurricane. But I knew her now. I knew the way her thumb tapped the steering wheel when she was calculating risks. When we arrived, the ocean was a churning cauldron of death. The cliffs dropped 50 feet into a swirling mess of white caps and black water. A spotlight from the Coast Guard helicopter cut through the rain, illuminating a tiny orange speck clinging to a jagged rock outcropping. The tide was rising. He had minutes, not hours. "Chopper can't get low enough with this wind," Isla yelled over the roar of the surf. She looked at the cliff edge, then at me. "We have to go down. Rope rescue. I need a swimmer." "I'll go," I said immediately. "No," she countered, her voice hard. "I'm going. I have the heavy water cert. You're on the line. You're my anchor, Vance. You control the descent." It was the right call tactically, but my heart stopped. She was going into that freezing, violent water, and I was the only thing keeping her from being smashed against the rocks. We set the rigging in record time. The wind tried to tear the equipment from our hands. I strapped Isla into the harness, checking every buckle, pulling every strap tight. My hands shook, not from the cold, but from the terror of letting go. "I've got you," I shouted into her ear, the rain plastering my hair to my face. "I won't let you fall." She looked at me, her goggles reflecting the strobe lights of the engine. "I know," she said. And then she stepped backward, off the cliff. I managed the line, feeling her weight through the rope. It was a physical tether between us. I could feel every slip, every sway, as the wind battered her against the cliff face. I fed the rope smooth and steady, my entire world narrowing down to the tension in my hands. She hit the water. The radio crackled. "Contact, I have the victim. He's hypothermic. Prepare to haul." The haul was brutal. The wind fought us, the ocean fought us, but we pulled. I pulled until my muscles screamed, visualizing her down there in the dark water, holding on to a stranger, trusting me to bring her back. When they crested the cliff edge, it was chaos. We grabbed the victim, dragging him to the waiting medics. Isla collapsed on the wet grass, ripping her mask off, gasping for air. I was there instantly. I didn't care about the other firefighters. I didn't care about the protocol. I dropped to my knees, grabbing her vest. "Isla!" She looked up, her lips blue, shivering violently. But her eyes were alive. She grinned, a wild, adrenaline-soaked grin. "We got him," she chattered. "We got him, Ellie." The medics wrapped the victim, and someone threw a heavy wool blanket over Isla. She didn't move toward the ambulance. She leaned into me. We sat there in the mud and the rain, huddled under the scratchy wool, sharing body heat. Her shoulder pressed against mine, a solid, shivering weight. It was the most intimate moment of my life. Surrounded by flashing lights and shouting voices, we were alone in a bubble of exhaustion. I could feel her heart racing against my arm. I wanted to kiss the salt water off her face. I wanted to wrap myself around her and never let go. "You held me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Always," I said. The words, "I love you," were right there, sitting on my tongue like a prayer, dangerous and sweet. I almost said it. I almost let the storm take the secret. "Good work, Cap. Hell of a rescue," Davis shouted, running past us with equipment. The spell broke. The world rushed back in. But as we stood up, shivering and soaked, Isla's hand brushed mine under the blanket. A squeeze. A promise. We had survived the storm, but I knew the real danger was just beginning. Because now, I didn't just love her. I needed her, like I needed air. The storm broke around 0400. The station settled into that heavy, exhausted silence that feels like a physical weight after a major call. The rest of the crew had collapsed into their bunks, dead to the world, but my adrenaline was a jagged spike that refused to dull. I couldn't be in that dark room. I sat on the back bumper of the engine, staring at the concrete floor. The bay smelled of ozone, wet wool, and diesel. The scent of the ocean still clinging to everything like a second skin. Isla found me there. She wasn't wearing her boots, just her uniform socks and that Navy Station t-shirt. She moved through the bay like a ghost, stripped of the armor that usually defined her. She sat next to me on the diamond plate step. There was no space between us this time. Her thigh pressed against mine, a warm, solid anchor in the cool air. "You're still vibrating," she said softly. It wasn't a question. "Can't turn it off," I admitted, picking at a loose thread on my pants. "Every time I close my eyes, I see you going over that edge. I see the rope going taut." But I came back up, this time. She shifted, turning her body to face me. The movement forced me to look at her. In the dim red light of the night sensors, she looked unguarded. The lines of command were blurred by fatigue and the lingering terror of the rescue. "Back in the office," she started, her voice low and rough. "I asked you why you were fighting this, why you were running. You said proximity. You said distraction. But that wasn't the whole truth, was it?
I felt my throat tighten. The truth was a live wire, snapping and hissing in the space between us. No.
Tell me the rest, Ellie. We just fought the ocean and won. I think we're past the point of protecting each other's feelings. This was it. The moment the cracked floor tile couldn't save me. I looked at her hands, those capable, scarred hands that had held onto a stranger's life an hour ago. They were resting on her knees, still trembling slightly from the cold.
I avoided you because I knew, I whispered.
Knew what?
I knew that if I stopped avoiding you,
If I actually let myself look at you the way I wanted to, I wouldn't be able to stop. I avoided eye contact in the briefing room because I was terrified. Terrified of the regulations, of the town, of the gossip.
No, I said, the word breaking.
I was afraid that if I looked you in the eye, really looked at you, I'd say it. I'd say, I love you. And once I said that, I couldn't take it back. I couldn't go back to being just your medic. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Isla didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She just watched me, her dark eyes reflecting the shadows of the bay.
Say it, she breathed.
Ela.
Say it, Ellie, because I've been terrified of the exact same thing since the day you shook my hand.
The air left my lungs in a rush. I love you.
I love you, she replied,
the words crashing into me like a wave, shattering the last of my defenses. I love you, and it's a disaster. It's a mess. It's against every regulation in the book.
I know.
But we'll figure it out, she said, reaching for my hand. Her fingers laced through mine, solid and real. We'll talk to the chief. We'll fill out the disclosure forms. We'll transfer if we have to. But I'm not letting go of this hand. We sat there in the dark, hands gripped tight, plotting a course through a different kind of storm. It wasn't safe. It wasn't simple. But looking at her, I knew I was finally home. The sun eventually rose over the Pacific, painting the bay doors in streaks of gray and gold. We didn't move until the first tones of the morning dropped. The door clicked shut behind her. There was no going back now. If you've ever found love in the places you were most afraid to look, I want to hear your story in the comments below. Subscribe if you want to see how we survive the fallout. Sometimes the fear is just proof that it matters.